Hi and welcome to my channel. My name is Lexi and this is my very first true crime and makeup video. This is something I've been wanting to do for quite a while now, and I've somehow managed to talk myself out of it for years now, and since 2023 is coming to an end, I've decided to give it a try. And I also hope you all stick around and join me on my crazy ride here. Now today's case is the story about how a farmer did the unthinkable crime on Christmas. And I could be wrong here, but I do think that this case is the historically first known Christmas crime case that has been recorded, or at least the first known that I've came across during my research. But before we get on to today's video, I wanted to mention that I am a very sarcastic person, and I don't mean any disrespect or any harm for anyone involved in those cases. It's just my way of coping with the things that have happened. The trigger warnings for today's case are physical, mental, and sexual abuse, as well as incest and murder. So with any further ado, let's get on to the video. On May 10th in 1886, Augustus and Nancy welcomed their son Charles Davis Lawson to the world. And he was born in Stokes Country in North Carolina. His father owned a tobacco farm, and already at a young age, Charlie, along with his other siblings, would work with his father on this farm. Now, I couldn't really find out that much about his childhood, so we'll just skip a little time. And in 1911, Charlie married a woman called Fanny Mendring. I hope I'm pronouncing it correct. Mendring? They got married straight away and also started having children, basically also right away. Only 1 year after the marriage, so in 1912, they welcomed the first daughter Mary to the world. And soon after marriage, James Arthur was born in 1913, who would later be known by his nickname Buck. In 1914, William was born, and 3 years later, in 1917, a daughter called Carrie soon followed. Charlie and his brothers decided to start their own farm, not too far away from where their father had his farm. So they were still kind of all pretty close within the range. Now, Charlie was a sharecropper, but he pretty soon realized that this wasn't really the path he wanted to be for the rest of his life. His goal was to pretty much own his own farm just like his father did. And just a quick explanation for those of you who don't know what a sharecropper is. It's basically you are a tenant working on the land, and you basically have to pay a share of the crop that you raised to the property owner. So Charlie was basically responsible for cost of planting the seeds, harvesting, and labor. And after everything was sold off, the landlord would take share of the profits as rent, and the farmer got to keep the rest. Feeding your whole family while being a sharecropper was very, very hard, because depending on the season, a sharecropper could make literally to nothing. And Charlie was well aware that he wasn't able to provide for his family in that way. And Charlie was very determined to make his dream come true in owning his own land. But in November in 1918, Charlie almost ended up losing his life. So what happened was that Charlie went to a Winston-Salem tobacco warehouse, and the following are not my words, I am just quoting. So, quote, "That's when a black worker called Jesse McNeil clipped in his leg when he pushed past him with a tobacco cart." End quote. And this made Charlie very, very angry. And he proceeded to shout at Jesse McNeil, and Jesse McNeil telling him to watch out where he was going. And before anyone knew what was going on, both of the men were on the ground fighting. And During the fight, Jesse pulled out a knife and stabbed Charlie in the head and in the chest. Bystanders were thankfully able to break the fight up and Charlie was immediately brought to the hospital. Jesse was actually able to escape but was pretty much found immediately by the police. Now, according to some witnesses, Charlie's condition was very serious and it didn't look like he was going to pull through. But despite his serious condition, Charlie was actually released on the 5th of December in 1918. And on December 20th, Charlie attended Jesse McNeil's trial, where he was found guilty of assault and he was sentenced to 18 months. Charlie managed to make a full recovery from his injuries, but tragedy unfortunately will strike once again, and in November of 1920 he and his wife Fanny lost their son William to pneumonia. 2 years later, after the tragic loss of their son, they welcomed another daughter called Maybelle to the world in 1922. In April of 1925, they welcomed their son James to the world, and in 1927, Raymond followed. After years of blood, sweat, and tears, Charlie was able to save up every penny and he was able to purchase a house and a barn on Brook Cove Road. It consisted of 128 acres, with the mortgage being around $3,200, and a yearly total was being set at $500. To Charlie and Fanny, family was everything, so it was more than important for their children to grow up near their cousins and relatives. So for the farm to be just outside of Germantown was just a big plus. In 1929, Charlie and Fanny welcomed yet another daughter to the world called Mary Lou. And by the time that Mary Lou was born, Charlie's farm was actually doing pretty well, to the point where Charlie started to think about a more modern home. He was also described as very well respected by his neighbors, a hard-working and honest man. But Charlie also did have a very bad temper. He would be strict with his family to the point where he abused them. And he didn't even try to hide it. He would hit or slap not only his wife but also the children out in the open for neighbors to see it. And they knew it. I mean, their own family knew that Charlie was being abusive. In the summer of 1928, an accident would happen which would change everything for Charlie. Charlie wanted to dig a trench to drain water out of his tobacco pack house with what I believe is called a pickaxe. He was so focused at his work that while he marked up the area he wanted to dig into, that he didn't notice the wire fence right next to him. While he was working, the pickaxe got stuck on a strand of wire and hit Charlie in the head, leaving him with a bad cut on the top of his head and also leaving him with 2 black eyes. At first, Charlie didn't even think that he was hurt all that bad, but he would soon end up developing headaches, extreme headaches, and also insomnia. It is believed that Charlie has suffered severe brain damage during the incident, because people around him noticed his complete personality started to change drastically. He would sit around calmly in his home, and the next moment you knew he was running around the place and checking the locks and also checking his shotguns. And I mean, it is 1920 and medicine wasn't all that developed like it is now. So there was not much the doctors were able to do for Charlie. It was becoming so bad that at one point Fanny woke up to realize that Charlie wasn't laying beside her. She got dressed and went to look for him, and she found him in the middle of the field where he was praying and crying, and there was also a loaded shotgun by his side. Somehow Fanny was able to get Charlie to calm down and go back inside the house. And Charlie's bad temper also just got worse and worse after the injury happened. His son Buck was the only one old enough at this time to help his father out on the farm. But whatever Buck did, it just never was good enough for Charlie. He would always scream at Buck, yell at Buck, just insult him without any reason, just because he didn't do the work like Charlie would have done it. But he still did it. And once Buck turned 16, he defied his father. He took the wooden switch that Charlie would use to hit him with, and he broke it in half. Charlie just stood there and looked at Buck. And from this day on, Buck actually started to sleep with his clothes on, ready to fight in case he needed to protect his family from his father. We'll skip a little bit towards the end of the year. Less than 2 weeks before Christmas, Charlie tells the family that he has some kind of special surprise for them. For this surprise, he would actually need to take the family to the town. And for Charlie's children, this was already a surprise because living at a farm, they didn't really get the chance to go into town that often. So they all got dressed and got in the truck and drove into Germantown, where Charlie told all of the members to pick out new sets of Sunday clothes. He proceeded to also tell them that they could pick out whatever they wanted, the price didn't matter. After everybody had found something nice for them, Charlie proceeded to tell the family that they would be heading to a photographer to get their first ever family picture taken. Christmas was just around the corner and the kids were getting more and more excited, even more now that they received new clothes. Christmas Day was apparently very, very special to the Lawson's family. Traditionally, there would always be some kind of special dishes that the family got to enjoy only once a year. And on top of the good food, they would also be able to see friends and family that they didn't get to see every day. And for this particular Christmas Eve, it actually started to snow. So by the morning of Christmas, there were about 6 inches of snow outside. And this is also the day where the tragic events of today's case take place. The day started out with the Lawson family and Charlie's nephew Sanders, who happened to stay overnight, having a family breakfast together. And just a few miles away, Charlie's brother John and his family were also enjoying their Christmas breakfast together. When John all of a sudden got this weird gut feeling that something terrible was about to happen. John didn't really think much of it, but he just couldn't shake this feeling off. He kept getting the feeling that something very, very bad was about to happen, where he had to get up and leave the table because he just started to cry. And unfortunately, John would be right with his suspicion. After breakfast, Charlie, alongside with his son Buck and his nephew Sanders, met up with some other farmers where they would participate in a shooting competition. They would set up bottles and cans to shoot at them and see who could get the most points. Meanwhile, inside the house, Fanny and Marie were preparing Christmas dinner for the evening. Marie made the cake and she decorated it with white frosting and some raisins. So mother and daughter were preparing and cooking for the evening dinner, but Marie also had a date that evening with her boyfriend Charlie Hampton. Marie and her boyfriend wanted to attend the Christmas play at the Palmyra Church, and Marie just wanted to look as nice as possible for her boyfriend. So after she was finished helping Fanny, Maria immediately started to get ready. Whilst Marie was getting ready for her date later on, Fanny was just running around cycles between cooking for her family and also watching her youngest daughter, Mary Lou, who still was a baby. After the boys finished with the shooting competition, Charlie had announced to Buck and Sanders that he planned on going rabbit hunting later on the day. And he also asked Buck and Sanders if the boys could go into Germantown to buy some more shells because he ran out of them, but he still needed some for the rabbit hunting later on. He assured the boys that surely one store at least will still be open for them to get the shells. And the boys agreed, so they went into Germantown and Charlie was making his way back home. Charlie had his shotgun up on his shoulder and his other hand was in the pocket of his winter coat, and that's when Buck could actually hear that Charlie lied. He still had enough shells in his coat, and that's when Buck could actually hear the shells, so his father lied to him. But despite that, the boys decided to listen to Charlie and just make their way into Germantown to get him some more shells. Now, after Charlie and the boys had parted their ways, it was approximately about 1 p.m. and Fanny was getting her two daughters Carrie and Maribel ready because she had arranged for the two girls to have lunch with their Uncle Elijah and his family. And the girls only had a short walk from their home to Elijah's home. The girls got dressed and went out the door. On their way, they passed the first of Charlie's two barns, which was just a few hundred yards from the house. The girls could actually see the barn looming over them. What they didn't know was that their father was hiding in a corner with a 12-gauge double-barreled shotgun and a 25-20 rifle. As his two daughters passed him by, he aimed at the back of Carrie's head and pulled the trigger. As soon as he saw how Carrie was falling to the ground, he aimed a second time and fired at Mary. Once Charlie saw how the snow turned red, he walked over to the girls. Mary wasn't alive at this point, but Carrie was still breathing, and that's when Charlie would fire a third shot directly into her head. So now Charlie Lawson has taken the two lives of his daughters, but it still wasn't enough for him. He took a scrap wood from outside and proceeded to beat the girls' head until they were unrecognizable. Once he was finished, he took his two daughters and proceeded to place them in the barn side by side, where he crossed their arms on their chest and closed their eyes. Once he was finished, Charlie made his way back home, loading two more shells into his shotgun. The first one he saw when he got home was his wife Fanny, who was outside of the house, who was getting more firewood for the stove. She turned towards Charlie and started to make her way back inside the house, and that's when Charlie aimed the gun and fired directly into the chest of Fanny. She also immediately lost her life. Charlie dragged his wife Fanny to the house, dropping her at the porch. Mary, who actually heard the shotgun go off, looked outside the window, and the sight of her father dragging her lifeless mother shocked Mary to her core. She started to scream, and that's when Charlie ripped open the front door and proceeded to shoot Mary right through her chest and into her heart. Marie also immediately lost her life. His other two boys, who were just casually playing on the floor, saw what had happened and immediately started to scream. And they tried to run away from Charlie. James was the first one he went after. The little boy ran into his room and hid under his bed. Charlie came bursting in, reaching under the bed, trying to pull James out. He slammed the butt of his shotgun so hard and forcefully into James' skull that it shattered. Raymond was trying to hide behind the stove in the corner. Charlie at first tried to use his shotgun to get the stove far away from the wall to reach Raymond, but after a while Charlie realized that the left barrel began to bend out of shape. At this point, Charlie started clawing at his son Raymond, completely ignoring the heat. He unfortunately did manage to get a hold of Raymond by his shirt and ripped him out of his hiding place. Charlie took his now ruined shotgun and slammed it into the head of his son, crushing his skull just like he did with James, leaving now only one child alive in the house, baby Mary Lou. She was in her crib, screaming and crying from the sound of terror around her. Charlie also crushed her little skull, just like he did to the other two kids in the house. Once he was finished, he started to prepare his family to be found by the relatives that would be arriving soon. He dragged Fanny inside and laid her out on the floor and placed Mary Lou in her arms. He then laid Marie, James, and Raymond next to their mother. Charlie took the children's pillows and placed it underneath everyone's head, just like he did with Carrie and Mary Bell. And exactly like with the two other girls, he crossed their arms over the chest and closed everyone's eyes. After he was finished preparing his family, Charlie took a minute to sit down and take a look at his now deceased family. Charlie, in this moment, truly believed that he saved his whole family. He saved their souls. Now, Elijah, one of Charlie's brothers, the same uncle that was expecting Carrie and Mary Bell over for dinner, was just finished hunting rabbits alongside his two sons, Claude and Carol. Around 2 p.m. they were completely finished up and started to make their way back home. Now, the route that they were on was actually pretty near Charlie's home, so they decided to stop by and wish everyone a Merry Christmas. Now, Claude was very, very excited, and he started to run ahead, ready to share his holiday joy with everyone else. And he threw the door open and just froze with complete shock. The picture that this boy saw inside the house was too much for him to comprehend. And years later, he would actually not even remember what he saw. The only thing he would somehow recognize was there was just so much blood. It was clear to Elijah that everyone inside of this house was dead. It seemed as it has happened all too long ago because the blood on the floor was still wet, and outside in the snow where Fanny was shot, it was still fresh blood. At first, Elijah thought maybe it was an intruder who broke inside the cabin and for some unknown reason killed the whole family. But there was still one question left, and that was, where was Charlie? Elijah and his two sons quickly realized that whoever did this could potentially still be somewhere around, and they didn't have any bullets in their shotguns and no other form of protection, so they ran for the hills. As they made a run for it, they would come across the Miller farm, which was the closest to Charlie's farm. Elijah started to scream and call for Mr. Miller, telling him to immediately call the sheriff and inform him and the neighbors to look out because someone had just murdered Charlie's whole family. This information spread like wildfire, and soon farmers left and right were grabbing their shotguns and made their way to the Lawson's farm. They wanted to see for themselves what was going on there and if they could do anything to somehow help out. Dr. Helsbeck and Sheriff John Taylor were the first ones to arrive at the crime scene. They saw the bloodstained snow and pretty soon also found the bodies. The scene was just horrible to look at. There was blood everywhere, covering floorboards around the fireplace. And there was also blood where Charlie had sat down to take a look at what he's done. As the news started to spread more and more, people were starting to panic. Some people had locks on their doors so that no one was able to get inside. People did truly believe that there was a serial killer out on the loose, looking for their next potential victim. At this point, everyone had so many questions. Charlie, Buck, Carrie, and Mary Bell were still missing. Sheriff Taylor started to recruit men to start a search party to find them. At first, they believed that the rest of the family was killed and were placed upstairs. Now, the only way to get upstairs to the attic was by a narrow enclosed staircase. The problem was, if there was a killer just waiting up there, anyone who will climb up those stairs will make themselves an easy target. Deputy Robert Walker carefully climbed up those stairs, but he found nothing except a few bloody footprints. They also realized that both of Charlie's shotguns were missing. It was a neighbor called Stephen Hampton who found the bodies of Carrie and Mary Bell in the barn. Now the word had somehow gotten around and people heard that Buck was in town. So that means that he was still alive, leaving only Charlie to be missing. One man in the search party actually discovered tracks in the snow which led away from the tobacco farm where Carrie and Mary Bell were found. The tracks were going towards the trees and the footprints belonged to a full-grown man, and looking at those footprints, it looked like this man was running. Around 4 p.m., Charlie Lawson's body was found slumped against a tree just a few hundred yards from the barn and house. Charlie had obviously been in the woods for some time. He was walking in circles around one tree. He walked around the tree so many times that the snow where he was walking was already starting to melt. He then sat down on the ground by the tree, pulled his shotgun up to his chest and proceeded to pull the trigger. The gun was laying next to him and a gaping wound across his chest. It took 4 men to carry Charlie's body back to the farm. The suspicion that was going around between the sheriff and the man in the search party was confirmed by Charlie's suicide. He snapped and proceeded to murder his whole family, and the jury saw it exactly that way. When Sheriff Taylor searched Charlie's pockets, he found several bills of sale recently struck with tobacco buyers in the area. Charlie had written "Trouble will cause" and blamed no one but on 2 of those bills. Now, we don't know what he intended to say, but it is strongly believed that the missing word would be me. Blame no one but me. But we don't know for sure what he wanted to say. People at first also believed that Charlie was planning to explain himself, but later on decided against it. So the question on why he did what he did, we will never know what was going on inside his head when he decided to execute his whole family. In his pockets were also $58 and the tobacco paperwork that showed that his business was doing quite well actually. And there is also one more question. Why did Charlie spare Buck? Was it some kind of sick revenge because Buck actually dared to stand up to his father and protect the rest of his family? Or was it that Charlie actually admired Buck for it? One thing's for sure, we will probably never find out the reasoning. Now, Marie's boyfriend, Charlie Hampton, found Buck once he got word of the tragic murders. He was also the one who had to tell Buck the news that his entire family was gone within hours. Once Buck returned to his farm, his uncles and their family tried to comfort him as best as they could and just be there for him. There was no official crime scene in those days, and there was also no official clean-up crews. So it was left to the sheriff and the rest of the family to deal with cleaning up the massacre. And I just can't imagine how awful that must feel to hear that within hours your whole family has been slaughtered, but for you to also be the one who not only to deal with the mental aftermath, but also having to be the one who cleans everything up. It must have been so devastating for Buck. And not only for Buck, but for all the rest of the remaining family as well. Women from the town nearby came and brought in their own bed sheets to give the bodies somewhat of a decent cover-up. Volunteers were digging the Lawson's graves at Bother Cemetery, excavating a trench which was able to hold 8 caskets. Mary Lou will be buried in her mother's arms. And it was still snowing so much that the cars weren't actually able to get to the Lawson's house, meaning that the bodies had to be carried down to the car. The owner of a local hardware store by the name of Bowley Tuttle was carrying Mary Lou's body gently down the hill. and he would later on recall that this was one, if not the worst experience of his life. The morning after the murder, the massacre made the front page news in 19 different states. By the 27th of December, newspapers were illustrating the story with a copy of the family portrait that Charlie had surprised his family with. The picture shows them all lined up, and you can see that even though Buck is only 16 years old, he didn't have an easy life growing up and just trying to protect and watch over his family. But in my opinion, it's Charlie's eyes that are capturing. They just have the look of a possessed man. There was also a picture of the crime scene going around. There was so much blood that a volunteer had to use a shovel to scoop it up, and they also dug a grave and poured the blood into the ground. This volunteer later recalled that a visitor was trying to get some of Fanny's blood from the porch to make a souvenir jar out of it. And when I read that, I could feel my blood starting to boil. It went even so far that Charlie's gun was stolen. And people also had the audacity to steal raisins that were on the cake that Marie baked only a few hours before her death. And to make things even worse, the funeral was also a nightmare. Charlie was a member of an organization called the Junior Order of United American Mechanics. Now, there wasn't a formal church service planned. Just a few words from the pastors at Browder's cemetery and the burial in the mass grave. The ceremony took place on the 27th of December. Mary Lou would be laid to rest with her mother, so there were a total of 7 caskets. But only 6 cars were loaded. Raymond's casket was actually transported in a private car. But there were hundreds of tourists that came to watch them arrive. People would park several miles up the road just to be able to watch the funeral. There were so many people surrounding the wood around the cemetery. Reporters talked to the people, finding out some of them traveled over 100 miles to be there, and apparently there were at least 5,000 people in total. The highway to the cemetery at the time was not built for that kind of traffic, and since it was also snowy and muddy, people started to get stuck and needed to be pushed out. In fact, the traffic became so bad that the cars arrived more than an hour late. People were so curious that they made the cars and the bodies late to basically their own funeral. Once they arrived, men from the organization that Charlie was a part of had to carry the caskets on their shoulders for the rest of the way because there were so many bystanders that they couldn't get past. The caskets were open so that whoever wanted had the chance to say their last goodbyes, and that's when Buck just completely broke down. He blamed himself that if he had not gone into town, that he could have stopped his father from even starting the killing spree. And as his family and friends tried to calm Buck down, the rest of the attending people were just trying to take a look at the open caskets. They didn't really care about Buck, they didn't really care about the rest of the family. They were just trying to get a better look of the whole scene. It took 3 whole hours before the coffins were sealed and lowered to the ground. And not only Buck and his remaining family were haunted by Charlie's actions, but the whole community was sad, angry, and just confused as to why Charlie did what he did. It was the number one topic anyone could talk about. And as you know, that's how rumors get started. Now, the majority of the people did believe that it had something to do with Charlie's head injury. His brain was looked at by Dr. Helsbeck and Dr. Taylor, and the results showed that they found no evidence of any brain damage. However, the doctors did find a spot on Charlie's brain that was caused by a disease. John Hopkins was set to take a further look into it, and on January 1930, it was announced that the results were expected in 4 weeks, but nothing ever came back. No evidence, no finding, no report. Now, I think that there was indeed something in his brain that just caused him to snap, but we will never find out for sure. Now, there were rumors going around left and right of suspicions about what could have caused Charlie to do what he did, but none of those rumors could ever be proven true. Another common theory was that Charlie never killed anyone and that his suicide was just staged to make him look guilty. People also accused Jesse McNeil to be the killer because he had served time for stabbing Charlie back in 1918. Now, it isn't even sure if Jesse McNeil was still alive at the time of the murders. Now, the rumors just kept escalating over years and years, and 6 decades after the murders happened, Marion Lawson's daughter, called Stella Bowles, who was born in 1915, told the story of a meeting that took place on the 27th December in 1929. Ida and Nina Lawson were each married to a brother of Charlie, and Nina told her that Fanny apparently discovered that Marie, Charlie's daughter, was pregnant and that Charlie was the father of this child because he had sexually abused his daughter, and apparently Charlie also warned Marie that if she dared to say anything to anyone, there would be some killing going on. Now, Fanny somehow found it out. I don't know if Marie told her mother or not, but Fanny confronted Ida and Nina that she was certain about this pregnancy. And Nina actually would be insisting that Stella did not say anything, so she didn't until 1990. A few years later, this story was actually confirmed by one of Marie's best friends. She said that a week or two before Christmas, Marie had slept over at her house and told her that she got pregnant by her own father. If Marie indeed was pregnant, she wasn't very far along. In the picture, you can clearly see her belly, and to me doesn't look like she's pregnant, or at least she isn't very far into her pregnancy. In Marie's autopsy, there was also no pregnancy confirmed. But in the end, we will never know exactly what drove Charlie Lawson to commit such a horrific crime. And years later, people were still going crazy and wanting a closer look into the house of the Lawsons. It escalated to the point where fights would actually start to break out, and that's when Marion Lawson came up with the idea to start charging visitors 25 cents to take a guided tour. And the money would also help Buck to keep the tobacco farm of his father, because he was only 16 years old at the time and he needed to make the mortgage payments. Buck ended up agreeing, even though the rest of his family was appalled by it. They tried to talk Marion out of it, but he would not hear any of it. On the 15th of January in 1930, this museum, I guess you can call it, was now opened. Sometimes over 100 people will show up per day. Marion even went further and offered drinks and up to 5 souvenir photos that people could buy to take home with them. The rest of the family tried to reason with Marion one more time, but he didn't even bother to listen to them. His only response was that people will show up regardless, so why not get a little profit out of it? The people in Germantown were also very angry. They said that Marion was an embarrassment and what he did was just shameful. At this point, several murder ballads were written to tell the tale of the Lawson Massacre. And of course, those ballads also helped keeping the tourists coming. And those tourists were keeping the economy going. And Germantown was actually thriving during the Great Depression. The rise in the popularity was increasing, and parts of the murder scene was sold off to a sideshow promoter, and he actually took some of the artifacts on tour. Whatever the family wasn't willing to sell to the promoter, he just created replicas of it and sold them for the real deal. It was becoming so big that the attraction even toured alongside Bonnie and Clyde's car. That's how well known this case has become. Years passed and eventually the sideshows started to vanish along with the attractions. At this point, people started spreading stories that some weird things were happening around the Lawson's house. Articles stated appearing that the house was haunted and a new patch of curiosity had started. People now started to park in front of the house to see if they would witness anything unusual. Now, decades later, the house fell into decay, and by 1980, the Lawson's house was gone, and the tobacco barn was plowed under, so there is nothing left to see as of today. And now for the only survivor, Buck. Buck ended up marrying, and he and his wife Nina would end up having one son who he named Arthur and 3 daughters who he named like his sisters. But despite having his own family now, Buck struggled a lot with the events that took place on Christmas. He would drink a lot to try and forget around the holiday season. He would lock himself in a room with a bottle and played a record of a group called Carolina Buddies performing the Lawson's family murders. And he would hear that on repeat. On May 10th in 1945, Buck and another man were riding in a work truck that got stuck in a deep service that was cut in a road for repairs. It is said that the two had not seen the warning sign and drove into the construction zone. The passenger was seriously injured, but Buck unfortunately ended up losing his life immediately. Buck never stopped blaming himself that if he stayed with his family, he could have stopped his father. And 16 years after the murder took place, Buck Lawson was finally reunited with his family. And we can only hope that he has now found peace. So that's it for today's case. I hope you enjoyed it. If so, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel, leave me a like and a comment on which case you would like me to cover next. I hope I see you all next time. Bye!